Welcome to Stockholm, Sweden, and to the 2024 Nobel Prize Teacher Summit Hubs. My name is Lotta Jeppson, and I'm an educator at the Nobel Prize Museum, and I'm here to introduce the Hubs to you. Just a few moments ago, we finished a program here at Münchenbryggeriet, where almost 400 teachers from all over the world were gathered to listen to a fantastic lineup of speakers with 2 Nobel Prize Laureates on site and to discuss with teacher colleagues. Now, here's your chance to join in. The Hubs format of the Nobel Prize Teacher Summit is based on local engagement, where schools, universities, science centers and Swedish embassies around the world, they invite teachers to come and watch the recorded version of the summit and to together discuss and reflect upon the theme. So the theme title for this year was Minding the Brain. As educators, understanding the brain is essential for creating a positive learning environment. What do we know about the brain today, and how does learning actually occur? Today has been a deep dive into the world of the human brain and into the importance of how we need to understand how it functions. How schools and educational systems can use the latest scientific discoveries, and how we as teachers can embrace the ever-evolving science of learning. At the heart of it all lies one central question: we must mind the brain when forming a learning environment. The lectures and interviews are between 15 to 25 minutes long, and it's easy for you to choose a segment that is most interesting to you, both in the broadcast and in the workbook. And if you haven't already found it, all the material will be presented to you at the Nobel Prize Teacher Summit website. So good luck, and we hope that you will find this material inspirational and it will spark some interesting discussions. And remember, without excellent teachers, no new Nobel Prize laureates.
A warm welcome to all of you to the Nobel Prize Teacher Summit 2024. There are familiar faces from last year's Teacher Summit and previous years, and also a lot of new faces, and you are all equally and warmly welcome. My name is Erika Lanner. I'm the director of the Nobel Prize Museum, and we have been doing this Teacher Summit for a number of years now. It is truly one of the highlights of the year when we get to gather, invite, welcome teachers from all over Sweden and all over the world. Treat you as VIPs for a day, have you listen to marvelous speakers on a theme that can really be looked at from various angles. And this is both rewarding and fun, and today is promising to be that as well. We are going to look into our brain's immense capacity, and also its limitations. But I would like to thank you very much for joining us on today's Mind Journey. I would like to direct a warm thanks to Erling Persson Foundation, Knut Alice Wallenbergs Foundation, Katarina and Sven Hagströmer Foundation, EF, Education First, NIBE, and Mannheimer Swartling Law Firm, without whose support this wouldn't be possible. And with that, again, a warm welcome and enjoy the day.
Thank you, Erika. And yes, you are so very welcome, everyone. My name is Karin Claesson, and together with my dear colleagues here at the Nobel Prize Museum, we are going to guide you through the day. And what a thrill it will be. We have absolutely amazing guests, and they are eager to meet you, equally amazing teachers, and together we will explore the brain. So it is always nice to start with something ancient, so let's go back to Egypt. When a person had died and was embalmed, ready to become a mummy, the precious heart was left inside the body, later to be weighted by the great god of Osiris. So that was the heart, a very, very important organ. Now the brain, on the other hand, was absolutely and completely useless. If possible, because that was a bit tricky, it was pulled out through the nose and tossed away. No god was interested in that organ, which absolutely makes sense, since the thinking was going on in the heart. Now, we can think, oh, how little did they know. But when Nobel Prize Laureate Arvid Carlsson some years ago got the question, do we know it all now with the brain? He said, smiling, we know close to nothing. That was, of course, not entirely true, because Arvid Carlsson knew something about the brain. He received the Nobel Prize for it. But I think the point was that it is so much yet to be explored, and a lot is still unknown, even if we today perhaps not consider it as being totally useless. So today we will explore this organ that we call our brain. We might spot some limitations down the road, but perhaps we need to look at it with gentle eyes, because this ancient organ is working very hard in a modern world. And helping us exploring this are some amazing guests. They're ready to do so. Gustav, can you give us some examples? Who are we going to meet?
Well, I can first mention, of course, Nobel laureate in chemistry, David MacMillan. We also have Elena Zhemkova from the Nobel Peace Prize awarded institution Memorial. But the most important participants in today's discussion are, of course, you, the teachers who are here. And we hope that you'll get as much out of this day as possible. And one way to do that is to make sure that you ask your own questions to our amazing speakers. Isn't that right, Sara?
Yes, it is. And we would like you to participate as much as possible. And we are so eager to hear your thoughts about this day. If you have any questions or reflections for our speakers, I will be your voice for that today. So on your table, you see a QR code. Use it to ask the questions, and then I will read them instead of you. But please make sure that you write your question under the right name, because all the names are listed under each other. And then I will read as many as possible. But now I have a question, Pontus. What is going to happen here today?
Well, Sara, this will be a fully packed day. We go through tons of questions and perspective on this, our most complex organ. And Karin, if the ancient Egyptians had known what we hope to learn at the end of the day, they might reconsider what they were doing, I think. So our day will contain lectures, interviews, discussions, and of course our breakout sessions, where you can dig a little deeper on some of the perspectives that you hear from our stage. And at 4:30 p.m. we'll close the day with some bubbles and jazz just outside of here. Well, if we need to evacuate the premises, there's emergency exit over there, and you can also go through the back, through the balcony.
Okay, so it's time for our first guest, and he is a memory master. Isn't that an amazing title? Like a character in a science fiction novel. But believe me, there is no fiction to this science. Please, a warm hand to Martin Nilsson.
Hello. Wow, there's a lot of you standing and sitting around here. I am a memory master. What I do is I do memory things, and of course you are familiar with that because that's what you kind of do with your students all day long. We're going to start today with doing something to get the blood flowing. So could you please rise up, take a look around, and just see how many people is in here? Because I will soon tell you that I have already met each and every one of you. Yes, I know who you are, I've seen you before, and you are all stored in my mind. And I will demonstrate that for you, but you need to do something for me first. I need you to arrange yourself around the table according to the order of your first name. So please find a way of sorting yourselves. So mingle around, you have name tags, the first name, and sit down, please. So I'm going to talk while you keep arranging yourself. So I'm going to use table 10 soon for my exercise. And I close my eyes so I can't cheat. But table 10, it should be Aleida. Are you doing it from left to right? So Aleida, then it should be Cecilia, it should be Didier, it should be Jacqueline, James, and Simon, right? No, not James. Sorry, not James. James, Jacqueline, then Didier, Jacqueline, Jenny, and then we have Simon. That's right. Okay. Starts out a little bit tough. Now you can sit down, please. Thank you. So I'm going to stand over here, since I already kind of know you, because there are screens everywhere, and it shows you the 50 tables. So you will have to be protecting the integrity of what I'm about to do. So I'm going to close my eyes, and we have Sara with a microphone. Can someone just raise their hand, and she will run to your table, and I don't know which table she will run to. So just call her attention, and I will see what happens next.
Or I just take a...
Yes.
Okay, we have here. Okay.
So which table are you at?
Number 13.
13 or 30?
13.
13. Okay, so now I'm going to have to move around. We're there, we're there, we're there. Yes, table number 13. It should start with Dan, and then it moves is a genius, so it should be Evgenia. Then we have Judith, and we should have, she's eating the Swedish Marie cakes, so Marie. Then we have Mohammed, Rashmi, and it should be Tuva.
Wow, that was impressive.
Thank you. Do we have time for another one?
And is this right? Are you... yeah, that was
I'm
right.
still closing my eyes.
Amazing.
So, yeah.
Okay, another one. Anyone? Yes. Okay, we have number 28.
28, then we are there, and we have to go upstairs, and 28. Yeah, so we're in the attic. I'm using different rooms to store this. Sounds a bit strange, I suppose. But it should be Daniel first, and then it's Dory, you know, from the Finding Nemo, which has a bad memory. I hope I'm not saying bad things about Doris. And then we're having Philip, and it says something on his shirt. Eva, I think it is. And it should be Marcus and Reinhilde and Valentina to the end. What was it, 28? 28?
Yes.
Hold on, there we are. 30, 26. I was in 27. Can we show 27? Yeah.
And where is 27? Oh,
yeah. Sorry, wrong room. So, okay, so 28. Yeah, okay. So it's Elizabeth, it should be Fernando, it should be Florentine, it should be Fredrik, it should be Hannah, Madeleine, and see you.
Hey.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay.
One more?
No, I'm sorry. We don't think we have time for one more.
No, that's fine. So what I've just done is, of course, I don't know you by your face, but I know everyone in here. You can come and ask me later on which table you are and what your name is. But this is just an exercise, because I am a teacher, and what I do is I use this to practice to do what I actually do, learn important things that I want to store away for the rest of my life. And of course, it is important to meet you, but it's also about the science, about the lectures, about the things that we need to keep in mind. But all of that, I have to tell you about later on. Thank you so much for now.
And thank you, Martin. That was so impressive. I don't understand how you do it. And we will see more of Martin later on today. But now, Gustav, over to you.
Thank you, Sara, and welcome to our first interview. And I guess Armita Golkar, who is a psychologist at Stockholm University, and you study emotional learning.
Yes.
What is emotional learning?
Emotional learning is quite a broad concept, but it does involve how we recognize, how we regulate, and how we express emotions. And it does affect how we also learn and process and remember information. Perhaps you don't think about emotional learning as also a very critical part of how we also develop social skills, such as empathy and understanding of others. So it's a broad concept.
And what emotions in particular are you studying? And are you studying the most important ones?
Of course. I'm mainly interested in what we call aversive emotions, such as fear. And I'm interested in understanding how we learn and remember information from threatening situations we encountered or from threatening stimuli. And particularly, I'm quite devoted to understanding how these processes develop in the developing brain of young teenagers.
So, well, I think it's not hard to see that emotion would affect learning just when you think about it intuitively, but, well, you know more. So what role is it that, well, let's start with the negative ones, emotions. How do they affect how we learn?
I mean, broadly, if we just take emotions as a concept before dividing them into positive and negative ones, emotions play this role in learning because it kind of interacts with many other processes, such as attention or decision-making. There are many instances of what we typically think about as cognitive processes, where there's interactions between emotions and these more cognitive processes, such as positive emotions. If we take them as an example, excitement or curiosity will fuel motivation, which is kind of like the first step in engaging in learning. Positive emotions can also make it easier for us to direct and focus attention to the information that we want to learn. And if you look at it from the other side, then what do the aversive or negative emotions do? Well, like frustration or stress or anxiety, they have quite the opposite effects. So instead of fueling motivation, they can hinder and limit our ability to engage and learn. It will make it more difficult for us under stress or frustration to actually focus attention, which limits and undermines both motivation and our capacity to learn.
And when you say it like that, it sounds reasonable, but on the other hand, it's not hard to imagine that, that it would be good to have some stress when you're trying to learn something, that it's a motivation to avoid risk or something, but that's not the case.
You could think about it as there is some kind of optimal. If you think about stress only in a negative, which I just did, stress kind of as a negative emotion, we can also kind of redefine it as saying that we need to be aroused, we need to be engaged to learn. It's difficult if you're sleepy or if you're not attending to the information. But stress in a negative way, of course, you can learn to be motivated by avoiding risks, but it seems as though it's more fruitful to think about how we can positively reinforce learning by having positive reinforcements, like what can I gain from learning rather than what would I lose by not learning. It's not that they don't work, but it seems to be more fruitful, and particularly perhaps among the younger age groups to work with the positive reinforcements.
And what is it that is affected by the emotions? Is it the ability to pay attention, or is it memory, or?
At all stages, we can think about at the first stage of even encoding information, we need to be able to focus and direct attention, and emotions do play a role in, as I try to exemplify, like a positive emotions can help to focus attention, for instance. I think the most critical part is probably the motivation in the first place, or making information personally relevant, to be able to relate and find why is this important, to make it meaningful. All of these things stir up emotions, even if we don't think about them as emotions always.
So a sense of relevance and that's more linked to positive experiences than negative. Okay. And is it this how it affects? Is it about? Well, it seems to be how we learn, but is it also about how well we learn, or is it also about how or what we learn? Are there certain kinds of things that are easy to remember in different emotional states?
If you think about the interaction with motivation, attention, decision-making, it happens through all these stages. So it can affect what we learn in terms of content, One way is to make it, for instance, personally relevant. That would change the content of what I'm learning, but also the efficacy, as you say, like how well we learn. We remember personally relevant information more vividly. We are more likely to retain that information at a later time. So it can actually affect all these different stages of both what we learn, how we learn, and with the efficacy with which we learn.
Mm. So it's harder to learn Is it harder to learn about things that we don't like, basically?
Don't like, or rather, it's harder to learn about things we don't find interesting or relevant, I would say. Disliking is kind of has a different connotation, but not finding something interesting is basically just rewriting the sentence to say it's unemotional to me, it's non-relevant, it doesn't really matter. So yes, it's more difficult to learn things that doesn't engage in emotions or that we find uninteresting, but it doesn't mean that we can't learn that type of information. So it's more trying to find ways to facilitate learning, not saying that it's impossible to learn something, but if we want to make the process as efficient and actually engage the fantastic resources for learning we have, then making it fun is a way. And there's no reason to avoid using all the capacities we have. And then we also enter the more kind of broad concept of what emotional learning can mean. It also means that an environment that also invites for social learning and learning from others, and that is a meaningful learning environment when peers connect or where we can connect to our teachers, will also make this environment into a more emotionally relevant environment and facilitate these processes.
So the emotions doesn't have to be related to the subject matter, it can also be related to...
It can be related to the context where collaborative effort or the increasing the self of personal responsibility can all facilitate these processes.
That's interesting, because one problem, I guess, is that if we learn more about things that we find interesting, well, how do we learn that they're interesting in the first place? It has to start somewhere. But then social, I don't know, pressure, but social factors can be helpful in that, I guess.
In sharing the information with others or finding perspectives by collaborating with peers in a classroom. When I have kids in school age, the first thing I think in this, think about a 13-year-old, one of the first things he would mention about something being interesting, half of the information is about the teacher, who that person is, how that person engages them in the classroom. It kind of starts there, and it seems as though any subject becomes interesting when it's engaging, and then the topic can then become meaningful. Also, if you help them to say, why is this important? It's kind of like answering questions of, why is this relevant? What can I use it? But the whole setting of having a positive atmosphere seems also to be like halfway, you kind of win halfway through just by creating that kind of environment.
And sometimes when someone would ask us, so why is this important? It's easy to think, well, because it has these practical applications, or if it's a discovery, or if you learn this, you'll get a good job. But that's not necessarily what the answer you should give, maybe. It's better to say, well, you can use this because it's fun, or it's useful because you'll be happy to know it. Yeah,
I think it depends on the age of the group that we're trying to work with. If you're always going to put this is going to be useful in 30 years, is perhaps not the best way to reach a 10-year-old or a 13-year-old. But having more a close in time kind of. So you know that it will be meaningful in a shorter time, a temporal window than 30 years. But I think the fun part can be that the topic is fun, or that learning and engaging in the material is fun. So you can squeeze that kind of like, what does fun mean? But I think in general it's easy to think about the fact that as adults we know that we have to acquire skills and learn, even if it's not fun to learn them, but we definitely have another ability, different ability to think about what the payoffs will be across time, and that's something that we have to be flexible about when we work with younger.
Yeah, and you'll talk more about this in your breakout, but you study adolescent brains, and as you mentioned, they're different from adult brains, but in what way are they different? Maybe.
In many ways, I think that's a big topic to engage in. But I would say that the social context and to facilitate learning is perhaps we have more obstacles when we're working with a group of people that are undergoing so much tremendous changes. So they have more difficulties in planning and executive functions at this particular time and might need more support to engage these processes. On the other hand, they are the best learners, so it would be a waste to not be able to make also capitalize on their efficacious learning and the tremendous abilities they have, but they need different kind of support than we do.
Why are they the best learners?
Because they are at a stage of life where plasticity and the adaptability, the changeability of the brain is kind of like as its absolute best.
So, but I mean, if you're or adolescent and teenager and you're in school, it's. I mean, you mentioned social factors. It's obviously very socially, sometimes stressful environment. So. And as far as I remember, I'm not a teacher, but I remember from school is that the main idea was to try to ignore that. You're here to focus. But would it be more helpful for me if the teachers would have tried to sort of pay attention and use the fact that this is a social group in more ways?
Yeah, for instance, when we say that the social context matters, peers, if we focus on adolescents, trying to capitalize on the fact that they are extremely socially receptive, and peer influence usually comes with a negative connotation, like everything that, when we talk about adolescents, is that peer influence is bad. But on the other hand, if they're very susceptible and very receptive, why not use that as a positive peer influence? They are more influenced by how others behave and by observing and learning from others, and better at it than we are as adults. So we just have to look like it's a coin, and you have the negative sides, but trying to foster and make use of their capacities rather than their limitations.
And that sounds that sounds like it's easier to say, but is it easier to do as well?
I don't think so. I'm not a teacher. I mean, I'm a teacher at the university level, but I don't work with adolescents. None of this is easy, but I do think that knowledge does help in understanding what their limitations are, what kind of support should we give. It will help us in trying to use the strategies and techniques that most teachers are already well equipped with and educated in, but knowing which ones and in what situations and for which group they would be more optimal.
And well, the research, I mean, are you studying this in the classroom as well, or are other people doing that, or is it just basic science, and then is anyone applying it?
My work is basic science, but I do collaborate with other research groups that have a more kind of applied setting where it's not easy to always translate basic research in one step, but we do collaborate and try to also have meetings and conferences like this to try to foster each other's ideas.
Yes, but it seems. Well, my first question was about is it sort of the difference between good and bad emotions, but it seems like it's much more complex than that, and we have to pay attention to the emotions more than we do, I guess.
Yeah, I would say that there are so many concepts that are they're so integrated. We use these words to say emotions on one hand, motivation on the other hand, and we know that the consequences of our actions are kind of the steering. That's what, as you said, the negative consequences or the positive consequences of my actions will reinforce my motivation to, for instance, repeat certain behaviors or avoid certain behaviors. But it's not that. If we think about it in a more like how the brain would deal with this information, it's not like we have an emotional center here and then we have something for motivation, but there's a constant integration of these processes, and emotions play a vital role in creating motivation and as I said, also interacting with attentional processes, decision making, and other cognitive processes that are together make out this whole kind of process of learning and remembering and making use of information. So it's one puzzle among many, I would say.
Yeah, and it's the first piece of the puzzle today. Thank you so much for giving that groundwork for the rest of the day. Thank you. A warm hand for Armita Golkar.
And our next guest is a neuroscientist at East Anglia University. She's an associate professor in psychology. Her research interests include working memory, motivation, and social cognition. Please give a warm hand to Sara Bengtsson.
So I think we are all familiar with group work, where one person is slightly more dominant and driving than the other person. And that is something that we look into in the study I will present here for you today. What are the neural and behavioral consequences of being the driver compared to being the person sitting next to the driver, engaging through discussions and observation? I want to say that peer learning has many benefits, but here we look at what happens when you're not fully engaged, both of you. More specifically, what we do is to teach teenagers computer programming. So they work in pairs, where one is typing on the keyboard, and the other one works hands-off by engaging in discussion and observation. This is an interdisciplinary effort where researchers in education and computer science, Anna, Maria, and Kristina, developed the learning material and taught the teenagers the computer programming. And myself and Andreas Lidström, we scanned the brain of the participants and analyzed the brain imaging data. And I really want to emphasize Andreas, who much of the results I'm going to present today is included in his PhD thesis. So to emphasize again, the main goal of this current study is to look at neural and behavioral consequences of learning hands-on compared to learning hands-off. So the students were taught Java programming in the classroom. It was about a 3-hour lecture. They worked in pairs, either hands-off, hands-on, or hands-off. They were then scanned with fMRI a day later. In the imaging scanner, they are lying on their back, and then they are looking at the computer screen. On the computer screen, they see tasks, and these tasks were designed so that they only had to respond yes or no. And they did that with a button press next to their thigh. This means that regardless of whether they learned a computer programming hands-on or hands-off, they all perform the same behavior in the scanner. So any difference we find in the brain between hands-off and hands-on learners depends on how they learned programming the day prior to scanning. So we had 2 purposes with this study. One was just to see what areas in the brain is important for computer programming. And the second question was, is there a difference in the brain depending on whether you've learned programming hands-on or hands-off? So in the scanner, we had 4 tasks of different complexity levels. The first task was a syntax error detection task, where the teenagers are asked to superficially scan the code to look for errors in symbols and signs. The next task requires them to understand the meaning of the code. And they are asked to understand whether the output in green is the correct output taken the code. The third task is very similar to the second one, but here they simulate the output of a moving turtle, a moving object. So it's slightly more complex. And the fourth task is a task that contains if and while loops, so it's iterative, so they need to keep more information in working memory. So why then did we decide to look at computer programming as a model behavior? Well, one reason is that computer programming is a language, and much of the brain data I will show you can be generalized to other languages. But the good thing with programming is that we can find naive participants who have no idea about programming prior to coming to us. So that's what we did. We selected only people who didn't have any knowledge about programming, and that's hard with other types of languages. The other reason is that peer learning in pairs, are very common in a computer lab, and it's very common to see one person typing and one person being slightly less engaged. So this is an overview of the project. So we have a classroom session. They learn Java programming, either hands-off or hands-on. We ask them to rate the stress and motivation before and after the classroom session, and they are given a learning test at the end of the classroom learning. The next day, they are scanned with fMRI. They have 4 different tasks in the scanner. Everyone is hands-off. We ask them to rate their task confidence every now and then during the scanning. And, of course, we can measure their performance in the scanner. The scanning is about an hour long. And then we contact the teenagers a week later and give them a knowledge test to see how much they remembered of the learning that we gave them. So what expectations do we have for this study? Well, the embodiment theories tells us that there is a tight connection between body and mind, and that actions and movement can not only teach us practical skills, but also facilitate conceptual learning. So we anticipate that the hands-on learners will perform better. But why is that? Why would the hands help you? Well, there are a few theories about the brain. Katarina from Kristian, for example, she studies children when they learn words and do gestures. And she finds that when you have learned words by gesturing, you then, when you read a word, like drinking, for example, when you read drinking, there will be activation in the motor areas of your brain. And she argues that the motor activation supports the memory formation and the retrieval. Others say that the reason hands-on learning is good is because you pay more attention to the object when you're allowed to touch and manipulate the object. And then there are reports that are less well studied, but there are reports of students saying that they feel more confident after having been allowed to touch and learn hands-on. We know very little about that, what that looks like in the brain, but I will show you some of our data. So the main findings in this study were that the hands-on learners, they reported lower stress after the classroom session, and they reported higher confidence during the fMRI scanning. And they also performed better at the long-term memory test a week later. So all data I'm presenting to you today are based on statistical tests. However, it's worth noting that we didn't see any difference in the learning task that we gave them after the classroom session. And there were no difference between the two groups in performance during scanning. And also, they didn't report any difference in motivation of how fun or interesting they thought the task to be. And the reason I mention this is that these are quite direct measures that teachers may look at. Did it help their performance, or did it enhance motivation? Here, what we seem to have is a slower process where the hands-on learning enhances confidence and then generates a better long-term memory. So we don't see really these direct effects. What we find in the brain is that the language areas in the left hemisphere, we have Wernicke's area and we got Broca's area, they are more active when you have to understand the meaning of the code rather than just superficially look for errors in the text. So these two areas are important for logical deduction and the meaning of the text. And as the task becomes more complex, we see increased activation in the superior parietal and superior frontal areas, as well as the visual areas, because they take in more information. And the superior parietal and frontal areas we know are important for attention and working memory processes. So if we overlay these results on top of each other, we see this lovely hierarchical structure. So the more complex the task, the more superior activation in the brain, and also the more lateral activation in the visual and parietal cortices. So I've told you now about parietal, superior, frontal, Broca's area, and visual cortex. But what I want to point out is that when you deal with the brain, one area never works alone. One always have to think about networks. So that's the challenge in the brain research currently, to understand how the networks operate, how the different brain areas communicate with one another. And that's what we addressed in this study. So we tried many, many different models. And what the computational modeling told us was that in this case, we have two parallel pathways of information flow, where there is one pathway between the language areas exchanging information, and we got a parallel pathway in the superior parietal and superior frontal areas, which then are more relevant for attention and working memory. And as you can see, the arrows here, they point both forward and backwards, so the information flows forward and backward continuously. And there is only, in our data set, only one place in the brain where these parallel pathways interact, and that is between Broca's area, left hemisphere, and the superior frontal cortex. So how is this network influenced by whether you learn programming hands-on or hands-off? Well, what we find are quite widespread effects. We got a stronger communication between the two language areas, as well as a stronger communication between parietal and frontal attentional areas. And this is, after 3 hours lecture, the brain has changed, or a 3-hour lecture impacts the brain so that we can see that the day after in the fMRI scanner. So it's a causal change. Okay, so for task confidence, again, we see this quite widespread effect where more confident individuals have a greater communication with language areas and attention areas. And then when we asked ourselves, is there anywhere in this data set where we can predict how well they will do a week later on the long-term memory test? So in our data set, we found only one node, and that was in Broca's area. So activation in Broca's area predicts how well they will do a week later. So if we go back to these theories, we didn't find any support for the motor theory, possibly because our movements are more abstract, whereas the children's gesturing is more concrete. Instead, we found a joint support for both attentional and confidence processes being involved. So to summarize, we conclude that working in pairs, if one person is more driving than the other person, can lead to unequal confidence and unequal long-term memory retention. We find that working hands-on leads to greater attention, increased confidence, and better long-term memory, but not necessarily a difference in how fun the task is or direct performance measures. So in the brain, we see that the more complex information, the more superior brain activation. And here is a graph of the brain's development, where if you look at the purple color is the most mature brain. And as you can see, the superior parietal and superior frontal mature quite late in life, so between the ages of 16 to 20. And that is why younger children have trouble keeping their attention for too long, or keeping too much information in working memory. So based on the fact that we are dealing with two parallel pathways here, It tells us that you can have an absolutely fine logical reasoning and logical deduction and understanding the meaning, but not necessarily a brain mature enough to sustain attention for too long. But the most interesting finding in our study is that Broca's area is so central to this task. Broca's area is that's where the two parallel pathways meet. It's involved in logical deduction, and it predicts the long-term memory. What we find is that the activity in Broca's area can be influenced by hands-on learning and by enhanced confidence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sara. And over to Gustav.
Yes, thank you. And well, now we say welcome to David MacMillan, the 2021 Nobel Laureate in Chemistry.
That's right.
I remember the year correctly, yeah.
I'm pretty sure that's the year.
Yeah, good. So, we are in a room full of teachers. How does that make you feel?
Intimidated, I would say. No, I mean, honestly, I was talking to a bunch of colleagues and scientists back in the States before I came over. And I'm not just saying this because I'm up here and trying to be nice to everyone. When I told them I was getting a chance to come and talk to 500 high school teachers, and I explained to them that, you know, this is something I'm truly excited about. And my colleagues, my scientist colleagues, were very excited too, because it's one of those things where you get the chance to talk to teachers who are into teaching, who love to teach. It's an incredibly sort of fun thing for us to connect with people like that. It is one of the best phenotypes. Since winning the Nobel Prize, you meet lots and lots of people from all over society. And without question, for me, being able to interact with high school teachers and high school kids has been one of the sort of greatest privileges of the whole thing, because the sheer energy, because you're talking to people who genuinely care and are generous people about helping other people and wanting other people to succeed. And I think we all come from a similar background. And so for me, it's always fantastic to interact with teachers.
And you say it's, yeah. And you say it's not you, it's lots of scientists feel the same way.
Oh, unquestionably. I mean, if you talk to almost any scientist, they will tell you about their experiences, about how they ended up being interested in what they're doing, which is almost always because of teachers along the way who were so good at what they were doing that it got them excited about it and drove. But the other thing is, scientists, as you know, the same as teachers, are curious about lots of different things. So they had all these other areas of interest that they were excited about that came from lots of different teachers. So the chance to get to talk to people and interact with people who genuinely care about the advancement of others and are so good at doing it, I mean, that's one of the things that I enjoy. The other part is we love to give, I mean, we try to be teachers as well. I don't think we're as good at it, but we constantly are trying to figure out ways of conveying information to people so they can digest it and use it and build it into their own lives. And being able to interact with professionals who do that on a day-to-day basis, I think is incredibly valuable for us, because we get to learn about how to do exactly that.
Yeah, because as a scientist, you're also, of course, a teacher yourself. Is that, well, what do you like teaching?
I would say, do I like teaching? I would say that I love to teach, but I also love not to teach. What I mean by that is teaching, as I think everyone in this room knows, is not something that you can take lightly or do lightly. You have to invest an awful lot of time if you're going to do it well. And for someone like me, I love to teach. Being in a classroom where you teach someone for the first time and you can see them get it, and you sort of see that expression where they suddenly go, I got it, is an incredibly rewarding thing. The problem is the amount of time that it takes is obviously extensive. And so with all the other components of a research activities, you can't do it as much as you probably would like to do it. So that's why you enjoy teaching, but we can't do it as much as we probably would want to.
But is teaching when you do get the chance to do it, is it just something that, even though it's rewarding in that sense, can it also be part of the work as a scientist? Does it help your research in a way to do it?
Oh, unbelievably. I mean, for example, and I won't actually mention this in my breakout talk later, the Nobel Prize that I won was because of an idea that literally came about because I was standing at a chalkboard, a blackboard, and one of my students was asking me a question. And as I wrote up the answer, I realized that basically this mechanism, this concept that I was teaching the student was something that could be used for another problem that we'd been thinking about for years. And it was, if that student hadn't been provocative and said, you know, how does this work? And if I hadn't been standing at that chalkboard, that idea would have never happened. So without question, teaching and thinking about the underlying aspects of educating people absolutely connects to creativity and what's about to happen next, unquestionably.
Yeah, that's sometimes when we see people getting the Nobel Prize, they are usually senior scientists. I mean, they're not they're the sort of leaders in the lab. And then you think about, okay, so when you see them all together in the Nobel Laureate every year, it's a bunch of little bit of not too young people. But then you see a picture of the lab groups and you realize that you are interacting with lots of students and postdocs which are quite young. It seems like research groups are much sort of vibrant cultures in that sense.
So Gustav, you're saying I'm old.
I'm saying you're older than some people.
Yeah, I think that's fair. So one of the things we always say as academics, and maybe you all feel the same way, it's very interesting, right? Because every year you get older, but the people you're interacting with stay the same age. So it's a very unique situation where when I was first a professor, I felt like I could connect with these people basically on a peer-to-peer level. 'Cause I was talking with graduate students who were 25, 26 years old. I was 29. Now I'm 56, and I'm talking to 22-year-olds, and I have no idea what they're thinking about. So it's a really interesting thing about that age differential. But the one part which is absolutely true in research, that the energy that young people have, and that's the creativity, the passion, all the things that go with that stays the same. And so I always feel as academics, as professors, we get to benefit enormously from that energy. Our job is just to make sure that we're helping them and guiding them. I think the key thing is not to guide too much, but guiding them in a way that allows all of that to channel that creativity into hopefully things which are useful going forward.
And well, I guess that the people who come to your labs and your lectures, they are sort of convinced already that chemistry is interesting, but many people don't. I mean, and that's, when you think about it, it's a bit weird, because everyone knows that chemistry is about explosions and things like, experiments, mixing things. But in school, many people find it dull sometimes. Well, first of all, did you were you interested in chemistry from a young age, or was it?
Yeah, there's three different questions that are in that question. So the first thing I'll say is, it's absolutely true that people generally, I should be careful how I say this, but people often assume that chemistry is dull. When I'm sitting on an airplane and someone starts talking to me, if I don't want to talk to the person, when they ask me, what do you do? I say I'm a chemist, and they immediately have no interest in talking to me. If I'm interested in talking to them, I tell them I'm involved in catalysis, and then they become really interested. So you realize that it's a lot about how you describe the area that what you're working in has a really interesting impact on how people perceive it. I always complain, physics and biology have it easy. In physics, they can talk about the universe, the Big Bang theory, string theory. It sounds really cool. In biology, you can talk about health and medicine, and everyone understands that. When people think of chemistry, they think of smokestacks and chemicals and toxic waste and all these problems. And so we intuitively have this kind of negative image associated with it. And it's a really big shame, because chemistry, as it happens, is often called the central science because it underpins almost everything. And it's an incredibly cool area. If you actually think about medicine, the people who make medicines are chemists. they're not doctors, they're chemists. Climate change, or overcoming climate change, is an inherently chemical and catalysis problem. The people who will solve climate change will be chemists. And so there are all of these aspects which inherently chemistry is extremely exciting, but we don't do a good job at explaining to the outside world how unbelievably cool chemistry is. So I think your question's a very, very appropriate one. At the same time, it's one that we struggle with. And it's often why I tell people, you know, catalysis. People understand catalysis is important, and catalysis is critical to everything that we're doing.
Yeah, I think that maybe the Nobel Committee did you no service when they awarded you the prize for asymmetric organocatalysis. It's an intimidating thing, but it's one of. So I'll give you a chance to do exactly what you're talking about here, because that's obviously a name that's, well, it's hard to get a grip around. But when you study it, it's not about smokestacks and toxic waste. Quite the opposite. So what's the beauty of asymmetric organocatalysis?
Well, the first part is, so I actually came up with the words asymmetric organocatalysis. We invented that terminology in my lab, and I was giving a talk last year in Glasgow, at Glasgow University, which is where I went as an undergraduate. And the chancellor, the president effectively of the university, who's a very funny guy, said, you know, MacMillan invented this terminology for asymmetric organocatalysis. He should probably win the Nobel Prize in Literature, which I thought was a great line. But at the same time, it's not about smokestacks or what it is the fact that if you look around this room, absolutely everything in your world that you can see right now is made by a chemical reaction, which is a kind of fascinating thing to realize, that everywhere you go in the world, everything you touch, everything you see, even things you can't see, are made by chemical reactions. And this idea of catalysis makes chemical reactions faster or easier, but the most important thing is it makes impossible chemical reactions become possible. But the problem is that catalysis generally use metals. Now, we're used to seeing metals outside. We don't think it's a big deal to use metals. Your car is made of metal. But the metals which are used in catalysis are extraordinarily precious. One of them is palladium. Palladium will be gone in the next 100 years, which is a remarkably sad thing to understand. They're just not sustainable. So what we did, and others, is we thought, how can we come up with ways of doing catalysis that are sustainable for our planet? And we realized, you know, we're all organic beings. We're all made of organic material. And as weird as it sounds, we're part of the life cycle. When we pass on, we go right back into the life cycle. We are regenerated in new life forms. And so we realized that maybe we should be using these organic materials to do catalysis instead of these metals. And lo and behold, it worked. And it took off like gangbusters, and that's where the word organocatalysis comes from. It's using organic molecules to do catalysis.
And when you say it like that, it seems like a simple idea, that organic molecules are better than metals, so you just use them. But if it would have been easy, someone would have done it before.
Yeah, people say that to me a lot, and it's still true. It was a simple idea. The issue is sometimes simple ideas are hard to bring into execution. I think for me, it was both the problem of execution, but also of dogma. The dogma was, this is how you do catalysis. So the idea that you could basically just go in a completely different direction, I think people rejected out of hand because everyone had just always did it this other way. And I think the reason why people got so excited about it was the realization that there was this thing sitting under our noses all the time for hundreds of years that we hadn't really looked at, and then all of a sudden we were able to do it. And the way I describe it is, it's a bit like going in your house and suddenly you find, you go into a room and you pull up a carpet and you realize there's a trap door that you didn't know was there, and you open it up and it's just full of gold. This is what it was like, I think, at the time, because it was this realization there was a whole world of chemistry sitting there untouched, and that was why it was exciting to get involved with it.
But you said there was a dogma. There were a lot of people who, well, didn't believe that it was possible. So what made you feel that it was?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I get asked that question a lot. I don't know, honestly. So it's one of those things where people say, everyone else did not see it. Why did you see it? And it's very difficult to answer because you see it, right? I mean, so you're like, yeah, well, it's kind of obvious. It's right there. But I think the other part of it is there was a certain naivete that went into it as well. I'm a big fan of don't necessarily believe that everything is known. I would actually argue the vast majority of things are unknown. And if the moment you accept that, you start to realize we're really being allowed to go off and search and find and discover new things. That's basically our job. And if that's your job, you realize you should be looking for aspects of science that are completely just sitting there, but people don't realize they're just sitting there. And I think there are many, many examples of that, which is why science is so unbelievably exciting.
Yeah, what I find sometimes interesting when you hear stories like this is that, well, first of all, you can think about that there are lots of people who had this idea that something should be possible, it's not, and it turned out that it was impossible. Right. But also, I mean, that was a thing that you thought was possible, even though other people didn't. But the other dogma you sort of accepted, or did you break a lot of dogmatic rules, or was this?
I mean, I think there is a lot of dogma in a lot of science, and it tends to be that we build up rules and laws. I mean, it's basically, if you think about it, in many ways, that's what teaching is. When we teach people, we're teaching people the rules of how to think about what is possible and what's not possible. And when we teach people what's possible, it sometimes becomes difficult to see over the fence into the things that we don't know what's possible. So I think what we're doing as a science, as a community, as a world, is trying to understand where things really are locked down and where things are really still being developed. There are so many, I mean, one of the areas that we now work in is the idea of using light to power chemical reactions, and that's actually taken off in a really big way for medicines, for pharmaceuticals. And because we now realize we can do all this chemistry using light that previously was not even thought of as being possible. And so that's been really, really exciting, but you have to sort of play around in those areas to be able to realize that there is another trap door that you've been able to sort of open up. But if you don't venture there, you'll never find them.
And is that something that you can or try to teach to students, and like to try to look for the things that they don't know?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, for example, when people are trying to get a job as a professor in the US, at least, what they have to do is they have to write up 3 ideas that are allegedly the world has never seen before, right? And these are proposals they have to put forward to try and become professors. And a lot of people have a hard time at that stage because you have to be, quote unquote, you have to be creative to come up with those ideas. So the question is, can you teach people or train people to be creative? Which I find a really sort of fascinating subject. Can you be creative on demand? And at least in my experience, I've found that you can. If you literally put someone in a scenario where you say, you've got 3 weeks to come up with 3 proposals, go. And your career depends upon it. It's amazing how creative people become when their career is sort of sitting there, which might seem tough, but when people are pushed to do things, they can become exceptionally creative. You know, that whole saying, you know, creativity, you know, invention is the mother of adversity. So I think that creativity can be taught and it can be learned, even though we traditionally think it's an intuitive or inherent thing.
Well, does that mean that science is, in order to be to have ideas, in order to be good science, is it that kind of pressure that you need, or is science? It's important for science to be competitive in that way?
I mean, is it important for science to be competitive? It's a great question. I think whether it's important or not, science is competitive, and it's because science is basically performed by human beings, and human beings, as their human nature is going to be, are going to be competitive with each other. There are always egos involved across any discipline, almost any profession. And science is no different in that context. So it definitely plays a role in pushing people. But at least in my experience, the labs and the research that tends to be most successful are the labs that have been set up where people really work to support each other. That's an easy thing to say, but it actually turns out in practice to be completely true. When you set up a lab where everyone is trying to interact with each other and teach each other and support each other, the amplification and the synergies that come from that are enormous. And it's one of those things that I wish we did a better job as scientists, is teaching this idea that generosity amongst people performing research towards each other is enormously valuable, not just for the research group, but for the individual, because they actually all benefit at the same time. And whenever I'm asked about this, I always say that's one of my group's sort of secret sauces, or that's one of the things that enables our group to be successful. We work really hard at having people in my group who are looking out for each other. And when you can really get that working well, the amount of great science that comes out of it is really, really disproportionately larger.
Yeah, I think maybe is it like that science, as intellectual, that the ideas should compete with each other, but the scientific work could be more collaborative.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely, I mean, if you really think about where so many great ideas come about, it's often at the coffee, getting a coffee, you're talking to someone, you're at a chalkboard, and people are just talking about things, and it's always where that interaction, where you're bouncing an idea, and someone takes that idea and takes it here, and then someone else takes it over there, and it's all that input that actually drives things higher. There's a really fantastic book, maybe some of you have read it, called The Wisdom of Crowds, and it's an amazing book, and it's basically the idea that if you take a crowd of 20 people and put them against an expert in any given area and ask the question in that expert's area, the crowd will typically beat the expert on the expert's subject, because crowds as a whole are actually smarter than individuals. I think that would make sense. So if you can somehow get crowds or groups to people to work together on problems, really intellectually work together, the way that that amplifies the output or the science or the research is absolutely enormous. And that's, for me, why, you know, I think it's really important. It's nice for people like me to receive nice prizes and nice awards, but it really is a reflection of these research groups and the ways that they're interacting and the output that's coming from them.
Thank you. Please give a warm hand for now. Thank you so much.
So our next speaker is a professor in cognitive science at Lund University and the leader of the Educational Technology Group. Please, a warm hand to Agneta Gulz.
Thank you. So, during the past 3 decades or so, the scientifically based knowledge about learning and instruction has grown considerably. But what do I mean by science, and how does that relate to research? Well, research, that's what researchers engage in projects and studies that may, over time, contribute to science. Science, or scientifically based knowledge, that requires quite a few things. If we want to have scientifically based knowledge about the phenomenon P, now in our case, something related to learning and instruction, there has to be a large amount of high-quality research on the phenomenon by many research groups working independently and using together a broad and adequate repertoire of research methods so that they together can really capture the phenomenon. And then with results and conclusions also pointing in the same direction. So there are some keywords. First, that one again, the systematically collected empirical evidence from many independent sources. And also here in our case, it's very important that at least some of that evidence has to come from realistic circumstances. By that I mean average classrooms, average conditions. Not just those where we have additional resources, which is often the case in smaller scale and exploratory phases of research. And an overall consensus to explain the empirical knowledge. Now, scientific knowledge is not about a final truth or like now we have the entire picture. It means that there's knowledge that is sufficiently stable and substantial to act on, and that we have functioning explanatory models. Then over time there will always be much work continuing to take place, modifying, adjusting, we finding more factors, novel interactions, and thereby refine those explanatory models and our understanding. A possibility to make predictions goes together with the basis for generalization of some kind. If there is no basis for generalization, we should not call it science. And finally, in general, scientific fields are international. So there's a large amount of research groups all over the world. They contribute to, and they also critically review one another. So without research, no science. But for professionals other than researchers, it's not possible to draw meaningful conclusions from individual research projects, single studies, like new exciting study shows. That has a value for researchers attempting together to build this big, you can think of it as a big jigsaw puzzle. Maybe that's one of the missing pieces, maybe not. But novel studies, single studies, are highly inadequate as a basis for decisions for schools and classrooms. Why? Well, because basically anything can be supported if you can choose a single research project. This means that if you do that, well, you can go for cherry picking. You cherry pick something that aligns with your ideology, what you wish to be the case, maybe something with possibilities of financial gains or career gains, etc. To have a digitalization of Swedish school is full of this. What real-world professionals need for their decisions and actions, that is to relate to collected, robust, and consolidated scientific knowledge. And I'll give you 2 examples now to show where you can land in those decisions depending on the basis you choose, science or research. And the first one is about mobile phones in the classroom, if the goal is to benefit students' learning. If we want a decision based on science, well, there is broad and robust empirical evidence that shows that when students are allowed to have their mobiles in the classroom, their learning is hampered. For one thing, it's clear that students use the mobiles for non-school related things, so-called off-task behavior, to a pretty large extent. That decreases their chances to learn. It's very important to know that this knowledge that I talk about then, it's based on many studies of many different kinds. Several of those are large scale. They are from many different countries, different angles. So putting together this jigsaw puzzle. So it's like we have the comparative studies that do look at learning outcomes, behavioral studies where we see like this behavior of task use, but also looking into contextual aspects, such as psychological well-being, that is also affected here. There's a bunch of methods involved to capture the phenomenon, and also, importantly, large number of researchers and research groups. So it's not dominated by actors who actually may have other interests than knowledge growth and contribution to science. So we have empirical data on this, but also we have ideas we can understand and explain this empirical data. And those models, they build basically on what we know about humans as informational knowledge creatures and about how digital devices are constructed. So in brief, a screen connected to internet, that will lead to 2 things. First, you will replace a boring activity with something more attractive. Second, you will do several things at once. so-called multitasking. And these are habits that are extremely quickly established in internet users. But they are in a direct contrast to a crucial condition for learning, to focus and sustain your focus. And now we're talking also about relatively young people. They should not just do this, but also develop their abilities to focus. And bringing the mobile phones into the classroom creates quite bad conditions for developing this ability. And a student with a screen with a variety of things going on will not just screw up learning for herself, but also impact those behind or besides, because you cannot not be distracted by a screen nearby. So in sum, if we want to base on science, we say no cell phones in the classroom. But one can go for research instead, which is what the Swedish Agency for Education does. An agency that excels in highlighting single studies and new research, such as novel Swedish PhD theses. So a teacher here now turning to the agency for guidance about mobiles in the classroom. Here, if you look and search for this, you will find 4 texts presenting research on the topic. They are all on a very positive note of the phenomenon. We'll go into one of them. This is the original, and here the English translation. So he says that research shows that thoughtful use can decrease disturbance from cell phones in the classroom. The research. First is a Canadian questionnaire-based study where a majority of 14 to 18-year-olds say that disturbances would decrease if teachers would support students better in their use. And also 8% of the participants, they state that they rarely use the mobiles in class for non-class related matters. It's a number that is very different from what we get when we collect behavioral data. And then it also says here that these conclusions, they get support from Swedish research. So this is an interview study with 13 to 15-year-olds, and they say the same. Yeah, the distractions would be reduced if teachers can change their approaches and be better at helping students to focus their mobile use on what's important to do schoolwork. All references also in the text here, except one, regards interview and questionnaire-based studies or philosophical theoretical discussions. And that, of course, that's far too restricted in terms of method needed if we want to capture the phenomenon. They do not refer to behavioral studies or studies looking at learning outcomes. But also, what is really found? Well, it's not that disturbances from cell phones can be reduced if teachers support students better. It's shown that students would like this to be the case. They want to have the cake and eat it. They hope that teachers could do differently so they can have their mobiles without learning being harmed. But there is no evidence that it's possible to do that for a teacher. But to the contrary, there is evidence that teachers have no chance against the combination of social media algorithms and, the very central information for a teenager that comes through a mobile. Next example, and I'll be quicker on this one. Early reading instruction, how about that? If our goal is that practically all who start school should be able to independently decode and understand simple texts within a year or 2. If we want to base the decision here on consolidated, well-established scientific evidence, the answer is to choose the kind of instruction that is recommended and described in the field Science of Reading. And that's a field that was strong already 30 years ago, but has been consolidated and strengthened over time. There are 5 pillars: phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. And you may have heard about or know about phonics, that part that supports development of decoding, which is one important part here. And there is strong evidence that if you use Science of Reading methods, including phonics, over 95%, at least 5 to 5% of those who start, they will reach basic reading and writing abilities within a year or two. So almost all can do this. About 2/3 are quite dependent on getting adequate instruction, and 1/3, those with the largest challenges, they are very, very, very much dependent on getting adequate instruction. And there are large amounts of empirical evidence for the phonic-based methods for working with decoding in terms of outcomes then when we compare to other methods. And also those differences in outcomes are well understood. We can explain them. Nevertheless, teachers, students all over the world are being taught alternatives to phonics for teaching decoding. The whole language-based method, or whole language with a little phonics, based on ideas such that if we let kids bath in interesting texts, reading will unfold, for which there is no scientific support, rather to the contrary. And now, since we have the brain here also as one of our, we know a lot also about the brain. That's why I can say this and be so certain about it. So we cannot base whole language approaches. They aren't based on science, but of course you can choose to use them on the basis of research, since almost any idea can be supported by some piece of research or other. So you can find research, if you like, also for this approach. And now I see that I have 1 minute left so I will also I will give you some takeaways. I recommend that you watch out when someone comes and proposes a novel teaching method or teaching project, saying that this is based on novel research that shows. Or someone comes, in my research I show, here is a method that bases on that. So overall, watch out for single research projects, single studies, novel research. And remember, novel is not necessarily better. Ask for substantial, robust empirical evidence. And also make sure that there is such empirical evidence that has been collected in real-world, everyday classrooms. Thank you for listening.
A warm hand to Professor Agneta Gulz. And now over to Karin with a new guest over here.
Indeed.
Thank you.
There you are. Okay. Very welcome to you, Lars Strannegård, President of the Stockholm School of Economics and Professor of Business Administration with a focus on leadership. Did I get it right?
That was completely correct.
Okay, good. Good. You have also written books, and one of them is called Senses of Knowing, a celebration of the pursuit of knowledge. You have said that education is an emancipation project. What do you mean by that?
Well, it is, right? Because it's basically all education is about opening up opportunities in life. And we have, at the Stockholm School of Economics, we have one oak door that all the students go through when they come on the first day. And when you're done with your program, 3 years or 2 years later, the idea is that hundreds of other doors are going to be open to you. And the fact is that education is at its heart. It's an emancipatory activity. It's about liberation. It's about opening up doors and creating opportunities and sort of unleashing different types of potential. And that goes for us. I mean, we are in higher education, but I mean, if you're a 6-year-old in India, for instance, if you go through school for 6 years, your opportunities in life are more as compared to if you don't do it. Because if you do that type of schooling, you basically understand that things don't have to be the way they are. You can question different types of power structures and see that there are opportunities for you in the world. So I think the only indicator that sort of can measure quality of education programs is basically how many doors they open.
At Stockholm School of Economics, you have made it possible for students to read and discuss novels as an add-on. Now, depending on where you come from, this might seem obvious that yes, students read, but in Sweden we tend to specialize quite early on within our education system. Why did you find it necessary to broaden the palette? Why did not students in economy solely need to read economy?
Well, I think it's actually very much based on technology, starting by there, because the fact that artificial intelligence is coming into our world really changes the way that we need to educate. And in short, there is not very much clarity regarding the division of labor. Who will do what? The machines, what will they do? And what will the humans do? And machines are better at artificial intelligence, but they are really lousy in being humans because they don't have any consciousness, they don't have any feelings, they don't have any empathy, and they can't make sense out of things. But humans can. So we basically decided that it's a very good idea to sort of distinguish yourself from machines by developing your HI, your human intelligence instead. And we abbreviated our educational mission as FREE, for the reason I just said about liberation. And the abbreviation stands for, first of all, fact and science-based mindset. It's not a research-based one, which we heard very eloquently before, but it's a scientifically based mindset, meaning that is more important than ever in this world of fake news and alternative facts and different types of polarizations. So really getting the facts and the scientific approach right, that's where we have to start. And then following from that is a reflective mindset, that's the R, which basically means that we now have to be really good at reflecting, trying to understand, developing your critical thinking, trying to come to grips with who is trying to tell you what, where do your opinions, your attitudes, and actually your feelings come from? Are they your own or are they constructed by somebody else? And then the first E stands for empathetic and culturally literate. And being empathetic is something that machines can never do, but humans can. So you can also develop your empathy, for instance, by high-quality cultural expressions, like literature, like art. So if you watch, Mad Men, the TV series, you will know what it's like to be working as a woman in New York in the 60s in the ad agency, even though you yourself have never ever been there. Or if you read Romeo and Juliet, you know what it's like to be in love with the wrong person, even though you yourself perhaps have never been in love and definitely not lived in an imaginary Italy several hundred years ago. And then finally, the final E stands for entrepreneurial and responsible, which basically means that you can't accept the status quo, but do something about it. And then realize what type of responsibility you have to the world, basically. And that's why we have fiction reading. You need novels, you're exposed to art, and the very idea of that is actually to let it serve as an intellectual and emotional itching powder. And it serves as a way of opening up the blinders that we all have, especially in Sweden, since we are specializing so early. So it's a way of contextualizing the world, making you sensitive to what's going on, developing your human intelligence, and thereby sort of increasing the probability that you can walk together with the artificial intelligence, sort of hand in hand into the future, instead of competing head on with it.
You elaborate on it very well, but do you still think that there is a language problem when it comes to advocating for example, then literature or art? In Sweden, we talk, we describe society with words like productivity and efficiency and profit and industry, which are all very, it's good and it's all measurable, but it's kind of hard to okay, I'm the high risk of being fuzzy. The last year's laureate in literature, Jon Fosse, the prize motivation says that he gives a voice to the unsayable with his prose and his plays. Kind of, it is in itself sufficient. Is it hard to talk about literature in the same way as the other fields, economy? Is it even possible?
I mean, it is possible, but you have to do it with arguments and words, and not with figures and statistics. Because it's kind of interesting, I think, that a lot, as you say, a lot in Sweden, of course, and especially in higher education, we speak about matching, for instance, on the job market. Words that are used in many other countries in higher education are, you know, ethics, citizenship, spiritual even, and sort of things that are more about the other aspects of being human. And here, it's very often just reduced to that which is measured. So basic, and I think that's a problem also when we speak about science. Very often the quantitative studies tend to sort of dominate over the qualitative ones, which is, of course, you need both. Because it's you know, the quantitative studies are about getting a large number of observations and then drawing conclusions from that in numerical terms. But if you do qualitative studies, you actually should not get involved with numbers in the same way, because quality and qualitative studies are actually all about words, trying to understand something, the characteristics of something. The word quality means, you know, of what or from where. So basically, it's about describing it in words. And if you then try to translate the qualitative studies and quality, basically, in general, into numbers, some things are lost along the way. And it becomes what you could call pseudo or pseudo quantitatives or quants. So basically, trying to get the impact of, for instance, reading a novel is very hard to do because you can't sort of measure very clearly what it does to you. You can't measure the impact an artwork has on you, and you can't measure how much in love you are, right? I mean, those things are very hard to grasp, but they are nonetheless incredibly important to education and formation. So I think it's we need to sort of stick to that type of language, while we of course are again fact and science based, which is the top of this. But it's all about getting a more, you know, multifaceted idea of what knowledge is all about in this day and age.
You also write about, or you oppose to specializing too early. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, I mean, if you take one of the largest university subjects in the world is management studies and economics, actually. So I think there are something like 70 million students in business schools all over the world. There are now 14,000 business schools in the world. And here in Sweden, we start specializing when we are 15 years old. So when you go into high school, one of the most, most common programs is economics program, which is basically economics and management studies. So then you start focusing when you're 15 years old, bang, 3 years of focusing on business and management and economics. Then you go into university, where the largest university subject in Sweden is management studies. So then you go in, study for another 3 years in a bachelor program. Then you've studied 6 years of economics and management and business. And then you top that up with a specialized master. So then you've been studying business and economics for 8 years. And I'm at a business school. Of course, I love business and management and economics, but it's not the best way to solve the problems that this world is facing now. For instance, the sustainability challenges that we're facing. Accounting doesn't do the job completely in solving that.
It's interesting because there are actually several Nobel Prize laureates, specifically in science, who have said that they came up with their insights before they became experts, and their point is that if they would have known that what they did was impossible, they wouldn't have done it. Like the story with the bumblebee. So it doesn't know that it can't fly, so it flies. So it can be limited if you are really also going into something specifically.
Right.
Yeah. Genius loci, the soul of the place. Also something that you work with a lot at your school. So why is the environment important for an education institution?
Well, I think what we do at the Stockholm School of Economics is basically to try to fill the spaces with art, contemporary art, most of it. And the idea behind that is basically, that knowledge can come to you in many different ways. It can be logico-scientific, which is basically what you study, what you read in the articles and the course literature, etc. But then there is the aesthetic communication that sort of speaks to you in another way. And so we are, our classrooms are nowadays basically artistic productions by different types of artists. They usually have some kind of subject that you perhaps won't see if you don't go into it and look for it, but that you can do actually. It does something to you, to being in a space that's beautiful or interesting or stimulating. Of course, it shouldn't take the attention away from the teacher, and we do that. We see to that that's not happening. But it is possible to do that type of physical expressions, and thereby the entire educational experience becomes more knowledge intensive. Because if you go through your entire school years in places where no care has been put into the aesthetic expressions whatsoever, it sort of shows that you're not interested in what's going on there. It's not valued. So actually thinking about the aesthetic expressions or how the place is actually looks, it means something, it communicates something. So I think it's very important to think real hard about what the aesthetic communication does to learning.
And art can be provoking, and you experience that as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So it serves as, again, in that case, if it's provoking, it can also serve as a trigger for learning. And it can serve as again, as this intellectual itching powder, And I think it's great too that as a student, if you're exposed to something that you don't really understand, that's a great way of becoming more humble. And the students that come into us, they're very, very good. Their grades are extremely high. So they're very good at many things, but they will not get an A in humility, right? So I think it's really good if you expose them to something which they clearly don't understand. Then you ask them to give some kind of explanation or interpretation of it. And that makes them a bit insecure, which is very good if you go into this world.
Yeah, indeed it is. Thank you so much. A warm hand to Lars Strannegård.
Thank you.
And now, I think it is time for some AI. Is that right?
Yes, finally, some AI. I'm sitting here together with Loutfi, who's a researcher in embodied AI. So, well, let's start with the, at least to me, obvious question then. What is embodied AI?
Very good question. Maybe we can start with what is AI.
Yeah, I thought that was too big, but okay, let's go on, let's do it.
And I mean, AI is, of course, many things. We could go way back to the 50s, where we see one of the first, let's say, principled definitions of AI by John McCarthy that says AI is the science and engineering of making intelligent machines. I don't think that definition tells us so much about what AI is. I usually say that AI is basically getting machines to demonstrate a number of capabilities. The capability to learn, the ability to reason, the ability to communicate and interact, the ability to plan and schedule. And now there's coming more and more abilities, like the ability to generate novel instances of data and so on. But you can look at AI as a kind of a family of different types of abilities that we want computers to do. And those abilities are similar to the abilities that we have. And embodied AI is about having those abilities in a machine that can also perceive its world through its sensors. So this is a little bit more than your laptop computer. You can imagine like a robot that has the ability to see, to hear, to even smell. And also it has the ability to affect its world through what we call actuators. So it can move in the world, it can knock things over, it can pick things up. It's the ability to sense and act, all glued together with very advanced software.
So sometimes, I guess at least for me, you don't always think about the fact that AI, ordinary, only interacts with the world in text, I guess, or code.
Yeah, in software on your computer, yeah.
So this is giving them more inputs. It must be add another dimension altogether.
Absolutely, and one of the things that we do as roboticists who want to not only create machines but intelligent machines is we talk a lot about agency. You know, the ability for a machine to want to do certain things. So I usually say, you know, you can ask ChatGPT to write a poem, but ChatGPT will never actually, on its own, come up with the idea to write a poem. But with embodiment, you might be able to get there. You might be able to get towards a better agency or an increased agency.
And how do you, then I guess that, well, first of all, some terminology. Is embodied AI, it sounds like a robot. Is that what it is?
So for the moment, it's a lot about robots, but I think one should also consider the fact that embodiment can happen in many ways. Like an autonomous vehicle, sometimes we don't associate that as being a robot, is one form of embodiment. You can actually have a lot of interacting systems. You can have like a camera in the room with that can talk to doors that automatically open and close, that can talk to other devices like your lawnmower or your vacuum cleaner robot. And all of that together is also a form of embodiment.
So we're not limited to being the classical robot form of someone like a humanoid shape robot. It can be all kinds of things. Or lawnmowers, I guess, are robots.
Right. Yeah, I think you basically need those three ingredients: sensing and actuation, so the ability to perceive and act, and, as I said, the software that glues those two together.
If you want them, then the machines to do something that we didn't expect it to, or on its own, how do you motivate the machine?
Right. So again, just backing up a little bit, I think when you're working with embodied AI, one of the things that is fascinating to look at as an AI researcher is to look at humans and to ask yourselves, well, how do humans solve certain problems? And that's something that I've done a lot in my research. And often when we look at how humans do things, we get a lot of inspiration. But sort of nature has given us a lot of very good examples. And one of the things that I've looked at is, well, how do humans, for example, learn? And how do humans have agency over their own learning? And how does that also develop and change as we grow? And one aspect that we've seen is very important for learning is something that happens especially in our younger years, which is connected to play. The art of playing, being curious. And something that we've wondered in AI and embodied AI is how do we duplicate this process? How do we give robots, let's say, the will to want to play.
Yeah. And how do you?
And how do we do that? Well, we haven't figured it all out yet, so this is research that is happening every day. One way to do it is to really be able to reflect about what you don't know, right? That's kind of almost an important ingredient, to be able to walk into the world and walk into a situation and say, and now I'm talking about from a robot's perspective, I'm a bit unsure. I'm a bit unsure about what things are, and focus on where you're uncertain. That's almost like curiosity, right? That you see areas that you don't know enough about, and you are somehow attracted to those particular tasks. That's one way that we can encourage machines to be a bit more curious when they start to explore. Another way is through abstraction. So we use language, and we're very good at language. And language gives us the possibility to conceive new concepts, to mix concepts together, and to formulate kind of very clear, explicit goals. And we are getting to a point now where we can start to automate a lot of the processes around language due to the recent advances in AI, like with large language models. So one of the things we're doing, and I mean these are experiments that are happening now in our lab, is that we put the robot exactly like I'm sitting now. It can look at all the objects on the table, and it can recognize, okay, I have 4 glasses, 2 of them are filled with water, and I have a bottle with water. And it can also just ask ChatGPT and say, I have these objects. What can I do with them? And all of a sudden it has access to the entire corpus of common sense knowledge from us. And ChatGPT will tell you, well, you can take the bottle and you can pour water into one of the glasses. And if you ask ChatGPT, give me some other goal that is different than that, it will start to generate other possibilities. Like you can start stacking the glasses. You can knock the glasses off the table. And we can take each of these kind of goals and let our robot try them. Let our robot play around with different scenarios. And what's interesting and what we want to focus on is not in achieving the task. The task is actually not the most important thing. It's what does the robot learn by doing the task.
So, and how do you figure that out, what it has learned?
Well, there are different ways to kind of look at the problem. I can give you another example to answer that question. Let's say that the task is recognize different images that have a number on it. So our robot decides to look at an image with the number 1, the number 2, the number 3, and so on. Now, at some point, the robot will be able to recognize all the numbers, all the way up to the number 9. But one of the things the robot can learn in trying to do the task is it can learn how to learn. In sort of teaching, it's basically it can develop its own curriculum. We've actually done this experiment in our lab, and what we've discovered is that if you want to get a machine to recognize numbers, you actually need to show the numbers in the right order. As it turns out, if you first learn how to recognize the number 1, and then the number 2, and then the number 3, it'll take you longer to learn those numbers than if you start, for example, with the number 6 and learn that number first. So to recognize an image with the number 6, and then jump over to the number 8. So the sequence in which we learn things matters. And I think maybe that's intuitive for us who are sort of teaching. But what's interesting is now we can start to duplicate this process for an AI And actually, it's starting maybe to reveal to us insights that we didn't realize before about how to learn.
And I guess that you try this, I mean, not just once, but so when you do different AIs, they all develop the same pattern.
Exactly. So we really try and find how can an AI develop the best curriculum. And that's something that we call curriculum learning.
That's really fascinating that it develops the same way, that it doesn't sort of just randomly find individual ways to learn. So there seems to be some sort of basic, I don't know, correctness in that way method, or at least for that AI.
For that embodiment, right? For that set of sensors that you have, for the set of abilities that you have, yes.
But one thing that strikes me, you said that at the beginning, the definition of AI is also that it's kind of skills that we base on what humans can do. But there are also lots of animals who can interact with the environment. Why start with human intelligence?
Right.
Or do you try to make animal-like robots?
Absolutely, absolutely. And you're exactly right. I mean, I don't think humans are the kind of epitome of intelligence always. And there are absolutely other types of, let's say, intelligent behaviors one looks at. But I would say for the most part, when we look, I mean, if you pick up sort of the standard textbook on AI and you look at it chapter by chapter, those abilities that are there are the ones that we have.
Oh, and maybe that means that's also universal, that it's just different. I mean, well, maybe we know enough about how animals think to know, but they also have probably some of these faculties as well.
Yeah, and I think the thing to remember is that AI is an umbrella term, and it's also very plastic. Things are changing a lot. So I'm anticipating as well that AI will mean other things in the next 10, 15 years.
Is AI a good name? Artificial, I mean...
Well, it's funny, you know, I've been doing research in AI for about 20 years, and until this sort of generative AI, these sort of ChatGPTs and large language models, every time AI has actually done something concrete and has become a product, we've stopped calling it AI. We call it like speech to text or, you know, automated planning or recommendation systems, like when you go into Netflix and you get suggestions. Now is the first time in my career that we call AI systems for AI. And I see some positives with that because, of course, that is what it is according to the field. But I also see some negatives, some disadvantages, because it evokes immediately thoughts to a lot of existential questions and perhaps a lot of heightened fear about the technology. And it's just a matter of semantics, right? I mean, maybe we should have been afraid of the technology before just as much as we are now. I don't know.
Yeah, so if I got this correctly, something you start to think about when you hear about these embodied AIs is like, okay, so what can we use them for? But as I understand it, that's not the main point, to try to make them as into tools. You use them for, that you said, studying how we learn in order to, and then maybe they can do things, but that's not the main reason.
Well, this is the beauty of research, right? There's different kinds of research, and you can do this basic fundamental research, which is asking yourself questions. And actually, it's the question that is more important than the answer per se. But then you can also do applied research. And I think being in technology, you can easily jump between these areas, from going to thoughts about, well, what is intelligence? How do we define it? How do we recognize it? To how do I provide a solution that will help society in the next 2-3 years advance? And I think one of the things AI is challenging is kind of the time it takes from that idea phase to actually seeing something concrete. In fact, if we look at how fast OpenAI was able to come out with something, it went extremely quickly. So technology is actually accelerating that scientific process.
Yeah, that's it seems to be going fast. That's a general impression.
Yeah.
And a warm hand to Amy.
Thank you.
Now we would like you to be a bit active and take a few minutes to discuss this at your table in a classic think pair chair. And here is a question to get the discussion going. What ideas did you get about AI in the classroom? This is clearly an important question to discuss. And I have been walking around listening to you, and I truly enjoyed it. Thank you so much for sharing. Our next speaker is a founder and CEO of the Institute for Learning Innovation. He is internationally recognized as a leading expert on free choice learning. That is the learning that occurs while you, for instance, visit a museum. Please welcome John Falk.
Well, I'm so happy to be here and to talk to you. I'm going to talk about learning and well-being. Let me give you a sense where we're going here. So the big question I'm going to try and answer and talk about is the relationship between learning and well-being. And you can read, I'm going to define the nature of learning, why people learn, the nature of well-being, and what these two have to do with each other. But you need to bear with me, and as I talk today in my brief time, I want you to sort of think about panning the camera back in time and space, and think about learning is something that happens all the time, and some of the time it involves education, and some of the time education involves classrooms and schools. And I'm actually talking about the first part, thinking about learning really as a day-to-day lifetime experience. So let's see if we can make this go. So what is the nature of learning? And this is, once again, really broad. The reality is learning is really, really complex. The good news is we've learned an awful lot about learning. We've learned more about learning in the past 20, 30 years than in the previous 200 or 2,000 years, for that matter. So to begin with, learning is always contextual. Learning happens someplace, at some time. And as people have talked about earlier today, when we learn, when we remember things, that context, that emotion gets encoded in our brains as part of that learning. We not only learn the content, but we learn and remember who we were with, where we were, what was happening during that time. And so, in summary, learning always involves an individual, it's personal, it happens with other people, it's social and cultural, it always happens someplace in a physical context, and what's also important is it happens over time, it's temporal. So let me briefly, very briefly, talk about these four contexts. So each of us comes into a learning situation not as tabula rasa, not with a blank slate. We come with past experience, past knowledge, past interests, past curiosities, expectations, motivations, and a desire to have choice and control over what we're learning. And all of that strongly influences our ability to learn and what we ultimately do learn. But we're social creatures, and we live in a culture. People are here from many different cultures. Every culture, every society has its own values and mores and histories of education and learning, and that affects how we learn and what we think is valuable. We learn because of our peers and friends. We also learn because of our teachers and our mentors and our parents and our other kinds of authority figures. All of those influence how and what we learn. As I suggested, we often, those of us who spend a lot of time teaching in specific contexts tend to forget that actually that's not the only place where learning happens. Again, learning happens at all kinds of settings and all kinds of places. And those settings and contexts make a difference. So we're all sitting here, it's nice and comfortable, but if it was 1 degree centigrade in this room, it would affect how you learn and what you would learn from what I have to say. Or if it was 40 degrees, that would change what and how you learned, even if I said the exact same thing. You were the same people. And then finally, learning occurs over time. We're constantly learning, and we also are constantly taking the knowledge we have, making sense of it in our brains, and then as we retrieve that over time, we literally don't have a photograph in our brain of what we just learned. We reconstruct it, and we make sense of it. And every time we recall something and make sense of it, we're reconstructing it differently, which is why memories are not all that reliable often. You know, we conflate things. So what we learn now gets included with what we learned before, and what we learn tomorrow is some combination of all those put together. So that's great. That's learning. But why do people learn? Again, remember, it's not just because you're sitting here or kids are in a classroom that they are supposed to learn. They have reasons and motivations for learning. And most of the research that's been done on why people learn has been done in the sciences. I've done a lot of this research and try to understand over a lifetime, particularly with adults, but also with kids, where are the places, what are the motivations that affect what they actually know about science. And the results may not be what you had in mind, but number one reason people learn is to satisfy their personal curiosity and interest. Number two, and this is true particularly of adults or for jobs or career-related tasks. Three is to support their personal interests, their hobbies, their activities. And by the way, in terms of science, one of the interesting factoids is that most adults, when you ask them, well, when did do you have an area of science that you're particularly interested in? Virtually everybody says yes. And you ask them, when did you first get interested in that? It's during early to late adolescence. And you could reflect upon that yourself. If all of you reflect on do you have any curiosities and interests, deep hobbies or relationship to some scientific topic? Probably you started to get interested in that when you were an adolescent. We also learn to satisfy our needs. So you may not know much about your heart until you go to the doctor and your doctor tells you you have heart problems. And then all of a sudden you become a really apt student about the circulatory system and hearts. We do that all the time. You don't know much about the law until somebody sues us, and then all of a sudden we want to learn about the law. So we always have needs, and we learn in order to satisfy those needs. And then finally, at the bottom of the list, is we all learn things that we have to learn, whether we want to or not, or curious about them or not. But that's really at the bottom of the list. Also in terms of science, sources of scientific information. Actually, this data is about 5 years old, and I suspect internet's even higher than it was at this point. Usual suspects, the internet, media, books and magazines. People learn from science museums and zoos, aquariums, from family and friends. And when I first did a study like this 20 years ago, school was number 4. It was roughly 50% of all science learned came from school. It's been steadily dropping as we live in a world where there is no shortage of ways to learn about things going on in our lives. Okay, that's all background. So, let's make sense of this. People learn continuously every moment of their lives, but we don't remember everything that we learned at every moment in our lives. Memory is really selective. So we only remember a few things across our lives. And what do we remember? Well, research suggests things that are meaningful. Well, what do we mean by meaningful? Well, things that are meaningful are things that we're biological creatures. We evolved to remember things that we perceive are going to somehow be important to us in our lives, in the moment or maybe later on, that somehow are going to affect the quality of our life, our survivability at the extreme, our relationships, and all those things. And there's a way to talk about that. People learn things that enhance their well-being. Okay, that's a whole different term. So now I finally came to well-being. What do I mean by well-being? Well, I don't define well-being the way most people, particularly in Europe and many other parts of the world, define well-being. Well-being is not a synonym for happiness or mindfulness or any of those things, although those can be aspects of well-being. Well-being is a basic biological function. Every living creature, even bacteria, perceive the world in which they live and try and put themselves in positions to do things that are going to be positive, that are going to help their survivability and avoid danger or endanger their survivability. Well-being is not an end. You can't achieve well-being permanently. We all strive to achieve well-being in the moment. It's a little like being healthy. Right now, I feel pretty good. Yesterday, I was sick as a dog. My well-being yesterday was not so great. Right now, I'm feeling good. Who knows what tomorrow will bring? And that's the way it is. Well-being is ephemeral, and we're constantly striving to achieve well-being. And because we're humans, we do this very much in our heads, in our bodies, and we perceive the world in ways that our societies and cultures help us make sense of what is, in fact, well-being for us as an individual. So, how do we tie this all together? Humans are really complex. And because we're complex, we've evolved all these different ways to enhance well-being. Personal well-being, we love awe, beauty. We love to be where am I going with this? We love to be creative. That's the word I'm looking for. We love to be creative. We love, we try to understand the world, spirituality, things like that. These are all really abstract, very recently evolved ways that we find as humans to be very satisfying. But we also, as humans, love to be curious, try to understand the world so that we can make sense of why we did what we did yesterday, as well as make sense of what we're going to do in the future. Again, we're social beings, and we spend most of our time in social groups, and we derive an immense amount of our satisfaction from being part of a group, being loved by the group, feeling that we belong to the group. In fact, study at Harvard suggested that the single best predictor of people who feel they lived a satisfying life is that they had good friends and positive relationships. And then finally, we are, again, biological creatures, and we spend more than half of every day focused on our physical well-being, sleeping, eating, drinking, those kinds of things, trying to feel safe and secure. So, learning is implicit in all of these four categories. We learn about the world in which we live. We learn to be spiritual. We learn to be creative. We learn to be curious. We learn to have friends and relationships. We learn to take care of ourselves physically. And this is just a constant ongoing effort that all of us are engaged in, day out. And it turns out, in order to support quality educational experiences, we have to actually pay attention to their learners' well-being. Because in order for someone to learn, they have to feel safe and secure. They have to feel physically whole and not hungry or tired, all those kinds of things. They need to be able to see the purpose of doing this in a way that supports their social relationships, their intellectual curiosity, their creativity. And they need to do it in a way that makes sense within their cultural context, how they've learned to define well-being for themselves. And if we do all that, we come to the conclusion that actually well-being is both a prerequisite for a quality educational experience, because if you don't have well-being when you walk in the room of your classroom, you're not going to be a very good learner. But well-being is also an outcome of a successful learning experience, because if we do our jobs well, people will see the relevance of this. It will have meaning to them. It will be something that they will carry with them and remember for a lifetime. And so as we think about education, as we think about learning, we should also see that this basic biological reality called well-being underlies everything that we do, including why we're all here today. Thanks.
A warm hand to Professor Falk. Thank you very much. And now we're very eager to continue with the program, so over to you, Karin.
Thank you, Pontus, and welcome back. We are so happy to welcome our next guest. You are very welcome, Björn Hedensjö.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah. Thank you. You are a psychologist and have written several books about necessities in life, such as sleep, how to deal with stress, and latest on how to become a more likable person.
Right.
Yep. You also co-host a very popular podcast here in Sweden, together with Lina Thomsgård, that's called Dumma människor. That would be kind of foolish people.
Right.
Yes, that's a harsh title, but you talk very tenderly about human limitations, I must say.
Sure.
Yeah. So when sorting out human behavior, as you do for a living, congratulations, we tend to explain or even blame a lot on evolution, right?
Yes. Some people sometimes tend to overemphasize evolution and evolutionary psychology, but in general, I would say it's for a good reason, because nature and nurture both matter, but if you don't think about humans as biological creatures as well, we tend to become very, very difficult to understand. You kind of need that piece of the puzzle to make us make sense. And actually, I would like to involve everybody in here in a little exercise to demonstrate this point. So we're going to have a pleasant 20 minutes together, but to begin with, we're going to have a few unpleasant minutes together. So, no, it's not going to be that bad.
Yeah.
It's going to be totally okay. So what I would like everybody to do is to, this is the uncomfortable part. I would like you to shut your eyes. This is kind of uncomfortable when you're with people you don't know so well. You tend to feel kind of vulnerable and exposed. But I do it in solidarity with you, so I shut my eyes as well. Perhaps Karen can do it too.
I am already closing them.
Great. And what I want us to do together as a collective is to kind of prolong the feeling of summer. We're going to extend summer by thinking about a song that we strongly associate with summer. So whatever song pops up in your mind, just think about that song, about the chorus and the verse. You have 5 seconds to find a song that you associate with summer. Okay, great. I want you to keep shutting your eyes. My solidarity ends here, because I'm going to walk among you, and I'm going to touch one of you on the shoulder. And then that person has to rise and sing this song to all of us. I'm looking forward. Who am I going to pick? There's so many people to pick, to choose from. Okay, I think if you sit up front, then you're probably into singing, right? Okay, everybody can open their eyes, nobody has to sing.
That is so evil.
That's a relief, huh?
Yes, yes.
Usually like 1 in 100 people are disappointed. They were looking forward to performing, but maybe they can come up on stage later in that case.
Sure.
Yeah. But most people are relieved. So anybody up front who had an increase in heartbeat when I came along? Yeah? So what's your name? Ylva. So Ylva had an increase in heart rate, and back to the point then. This is like an ancient evolutionary response to this is an acute stress reaction intended to make us take on a threat in a better way, to relocate resources to meet this threat. And the increased heartbeat is about pumping blood to large muscle groups, the fight-flight response and all that. So that response makes sense on the savannah, but not as much when you're interviewed for a job and you have the same kind of reaction. Maybe you get sweaty, and the evolutionary purpose is to cool down the body in a kind of, you meet a tiger on the savannah setting. Makes sense, but in the interview with a recruiter, it doesn't make as much sense to get all sweaty, right? Unless it's a very strange recruiter who tries to grab you, and then you can kind of wiggle out of the grip. So
otherwise, no.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a counterproductive in a way.
Yeah, it can be, sure.
So if evolution is such a slow cooker, as it seems to be, and if we are aware of all this, can't we just speed it up?
Unfortunately, we can't. And it's kind of been put out of play too in this modern context.
Speaking of evolution, our brain seems to be very oriented towards risks and threats, as you said.
Right.
One thing that seems to be a gigantic issue to us is our fear of not being liked.
Yes.
Why is that such a big thing for us?
Yes. As a species, we are so socially anxious. And that has to do with the fact that we're social animals. And we evolved in groups, in a group setting, and it was very, very important what other members of the group thought of you. So if they would kind of judge you and come to the conclusion that you weren't a fit for the group, then you would risk being left on your own on the savannah, and which would equal a death threat in that setting. And that explains, according to evolutionary psychologists, why we are like if you're about to hold a speech at a wedding, for example, and you get that, you feel like you're going to die, literally, even though you're in a situation that doesn't pose any risk. And that is the explanation. It's the inner cave person that kind of reacts to this perceived threat of being evaluated in a social setting.
Yeah. That's again counterproductive, because then if you so much want to be liked, and then you get all this stress, and then you act even more weird than normally.
Yes.
So it's
if that's possible. Yeah.
If that is possible, yeah, theoretically.
Yes,
yeah.
It's actually incredibly fascinating how much we self-sabotage when it comes to like social interactions. For example, let's say I would get a new fancy job at the Nobel Foundation, right? In my dreams, and I come there for my first day, and I meet my team. You're one of them, and maybe I understand somewhere that it would be wise to step into the room with a smile and a positive attitude. Hi, everybody. I'm Björn, and I'm your new colleague. But what if I do that? I step into the room all happy, and you guys are like, hi. Or even worse, ignore me. That would be very humiliating, right? So what I do to protect my fragile ego is I step into the room like this. Hi.
Cool guy.
Cool guy. And you guys will think, this Björn guy, he seems like super, I don't like his style. I'm not going to ask him out for lunch. And then you have a negative spiral in that interaction. Yeah. So that's one example.
Yeah. And it's also funny because we are, I mean, it's brutally clear for some of us that perfection is a mission impossible. And still we kind of strive towards this. And you who have students who are exposed to social media where perfection actually seems to be something that you could reach if you get the, you know, the perfect body or the perfect breakfast or the perfect anything, whatever it is. But we are more tolerant to other persons' imperfections than our own. How does that work?
Absolutely. We even like it. Like imperfection, we like imperfection because it makes us connect. If we would perceive somebody else as perfect or trying to be perfect, that's going to be something that creates a distance between you and somebody else. But we really self-sabotage in that way too. For example, let's say I'm seated next to you at a dinner party, and I know I have like a couple of hours to form a good impression. Then I'm going to spend some time kind of like bragging, selling myself, right? And that's actually going to decrease the chance of us connecting, because real intimacy is created when people dare to show more of themselves. There's plenty of interesting studies about that. Yeah.
Yeah. And a little bit of self-criticism is of course good, but it can also go berserk. For example, we had the last year's laureate in chemistry, Professor Maunji Bawendi. He talks about suffering from imposter syndrome. So and that's funny because he's pretty good.
Don't we all?
Yes,
yeah.
But he's a Nobel Prize laureate, and
yes.
that's funny situation because he discovered quantum dots, and most of us don't do that.
That's true.
But he still talks about this gigantic fear of being a fraud,
being found out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So the success is not a vaccine towards that, or the self-doubt.
No, not necessarily. Not necessarily.
Not even a Nobel Prize.
No.
That's a pity. Yeah.
No, actually, I meet a lot of clients like that who come to me to be treated for perfectionism or something along that line, and they are often hugely successful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You spoke about when you enter a room and you have a kind of a bad attitude because you're nervous, and then you will meet people that get the same attitude, so it becomes a bad spiral. But it's also in your book that you wrote about how to be likable. You also talk about how it goes the other way around also. So if you are kind, for example, that will actually make people kind to you. I'm thinking of for you who were here, I think it was 2 years ago when the Peace Laureate Kailash Satyarthi was here. He spoke about his work of globalizing compassion. And he thinks that compassion itself is a method to fight inequalities and wars. It's a key thing for him. And I'm thinking of kindness is almost the same, or it is the same.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Pro-social behaviors is the psychology term, which, like, if you're compassionate and empathetic, then you tend to do nice stuff for other people. You say hi to the person driving the bus, or you're just a nicer person in everyday life.
And you can train.
You can train it. It's like a muscle, actually. I read, just the other week, I read these really fascinating studies about reading fictional literature. and the effect it has on your attitudes and behaviors when it comes to empathy and compassion. So that's a very powerful medicine to read books, fiction.
We had the president of Stockholm School of Economics here earlier today, Lars Strannegård, and he spoke exactly about literature or fiction related to empathy. You have a good advice in your book. You have many good advices in your book, but one is fake it till you make it. It won't work on quantum dots,
right?
But it might work on social interactions.
Yes, absolutely. So, for example, I think the greatest advice when it comes to social interactions is very simple, but brilliant. It's behave as if people already like you. Behave as if people already like you. So when you meet a new group of people, what you tend to do is you tend to get rid of likable behaviors often. So the method is, think about what behaviors do you display when you're with people that you feel really safe with, when you're with your family or your best friends or whatever. You have a certain set of behaviors. You perhaps laugh more, you tell more jokes, you're more open about things you have done, stuff like that. You maybe admit mistakes, stuff like that. And if you bring all of those behaviors into a new setting, you tend to have build new relationships much faster. So if you go into, for example, a new team at work and you behave as if they already liked you, as if you were already in a nice and safe setting, then that's going to accelerate the relationships with people there.
That's
maybe easier said than done, but
yeah, but it's a good advice.
Yeah,
and you can train, you can practice.
Sure, absolutely.
A warm hand to Björn Hedensjö.
Thank you.
Okay, and now it's time for some more reflection. And I was thinking about what they were talking about, and my mind got stuck with mistakes. As a teacher, I made so many mistakes in the classroom, and some of them were more crazy than others. But of course, I learned something from it, so maybe it wasn't just a bad thing. And now we would like you to be a bit brave for a moment. Let's share our mistakes with each other. Talk with your neighbors about the crazy stuff that has happened in your classroom. Take a few minutes and share your mistakes. Thank you all for being so brave and for sharing your experiences. Now it is time for our last guest, Karin.
Thank you, Sara. In 2022, the Nobel Peace Prize was shared between the imprisoned human rights activist Ales Bialyatsky in Belarus, the human rights organization, the Center for Civil Liberties in Ukraine, and Memorial in Russia. Divided geographically, but also by war and non-democratic regimes. These three laureates still fights for the same thing. Please, a warm welcome from Memorial, Elena Zhemkova. And also welcome Vadim Belenki, who will translate between English and Russian. So we are, yes, good. We are so happy to have you here in Stockholm, Elena Zhemkova. You are one of the founders of the human rights organization Memorial. And since it started in Russia in the late 80s, during times of perestroika and glasnost, you and your personal engagement have included significant research, publications, exhibitions, as well as developing Memorial into an international movement. What was the purpose and mission of Memorial when you first got involved?
Прежде всего, я хочу сказать, что я очень уважаю профессию учителя.
First and foremost, I'd like to say that I have the deepest respect for the profession of a teacher.
И я считаю, что это тот мост, который строится в будущее. Как вы научите людей, таким и будет наше будущее.
And I think that this is how we create a bridge to the future. So the way you teach your pupils, this is how you create our future.
Наше будущее зависит от вас, и поэтому выступать здесь перед вами – это и честь для меня, и большая ответственность.
So our future is in your hands, therefore being here today, it's also a big honor, but also a huge responsibility.
Мемориал – это движение людей за правду.
Memorial is a movement of people for truth.
И это одновременно попытка защитить достоинство и права человека сегодня.
But at the same time, this is an attempt to protect the dignity and the human rights today.
Мемориал был ответом людей, переживших тоталитарный режим советский, ответом на убийство, на отнятое имущество, на погубленную жизнь.
And memorial was an answer given by the people who survived the totalitarian Soviet regime, a response to murder, a response to stolen property, a response to destroyed lives.
Мемориал, люди знали правду, но они не могли о ней говорить. Они хотели говорить правду.
So people knew the truth, but they couldn't speak about the truth, but they wanted to speak the truth.
И люди не хотели, чтобы то, что страшное было, чтобы оно повторилось. Вот это была и остается идея мемориала.
And people didn't want the horrible things which have happened to the past to repeat themselves. This was and this is the idea behind memorial.
То есть мемориал – это соединение нашего прошлого, каким бы преступным, страшным это прошлое не было, соединение с сегодняшним днем.
So memorial joins together our past, no matter how horrible, how criminal our past was, joining our past with today, with the present.
Но вы учителя, и вам, как я думаю, всегда нужно давать людям какую-то надежду.
But you're a teacher, so I hope that your task is to give some kind of hope to people.
Поэтому мне кажется, что важно, чтобы вы понимали, что мемориал этот не только рассказ о преступлении и о жертвах.
So therefore it's important for you to understand that memorial is not just a story of victims and crimes.
Мемориал – это рассказ о человеке.
But memorial is the story about human beings.
А человек бывает очень разным. И мемориал – это тоже память о любви, о дружбе, о спасении в трудную минуту, о поддержке.
And human beings are different. So memorial are also memories of love, of friendship, of being saved in difficult moments, of support.
И о том, что человек, даже когда он оказывается почти один против диктатуры, против ужасного преступления, против войны, человек вообще-то очень много может.
And this is a story that a human being, even being almost by itself, facing dictatorship, facing horrible crimes, facing wars, a human being is capable of a lot.
И поскольку мы с вами, к сожалению, сейчас живем внутри войны, я думаю, что для сегодняшнего дня вот эта память о том, что преступления должны быть не забыты и преступники должны быть наказаны.
And since we're living today in the time of war, I think today it's very important to remember that the crimes should not be forgotten, the criminals have to be brought to justice.
Что жертвы требуют компенсации и милосердия.
And the victims, they need compensation, they need mercy.
А человек – это единица измерения истории.
And a human being is the measurement unit for history.
Thank you. And you have compared the Soviet and Nazi repressive mechanisms, a huge system with incomprehensible numbers of victims. But as you said, there are people behind every number. How have you collected the stories that emphasize on people, not on numbers, not on the machinery?
Ну, это почти самая сложная задача. Как, говоря об огромных масштабах, и обязательно о них нужно говорить, как одновременно не потерять лицо человека.
This is the most difficult task, because on one hand, speaking about the large numbers, and you have to speak about the large numbers. You shouldn't forget them. At the same time, you shouldn't lose the human face.
И это тем более сложно, что мы с вами постепенно, ведь свидетели уходят. И когда нет живых свидетелей, это очень трудно рассказывать о том, что было без свидетеля.
And another difficulty is that the witnesses, they're leaving us, and then when there are no live witnesses anymore, it's very difficult to tell about the events of the past.
И я думаю, что вы как раз как учителя почти каждый день с этим сталкиваетесь. Как пробиться через учебник, рассказывая факты, честно, но как пробиться просто к сердцу ученика?
And I think as teachers, you are facing this every day, how to sort of break through this school book, how to tell honestly about the facts, but how to reach the heart of your pupils.
И мы нашу задачу мемориала, мы как раз в этом видели, что с одной стороны нам очень важно сохранить факты, сохранить память как можно больше.
So, and this is, we as Memorial, we saw that as our task. So on one hand, we try to save the facts, collect the facts as much as possible.
Сохранить человеческие свидетельства, с одной стороны.
So to save the human testimony, this was on one hand.
И поэтому мы собрали большой архив документов и музейную коллекцию, записали много свидетельств, интервью.
And therefore we have collected a huge archive, a whole museum collection. We have recorded a large number of testimonies and interviews.
Но с другой стороны, чрезвычайно важно, чтобы люди имели доступ в государственные архивы.
But on the other hand, it's also extremely important that people have access to state archives.
Государство, всякое государство, тоже хранит нашу память, в том числе нашу официальную память.
Because the states, all the states, they are also keepers of our memories. They're the keepers of our official memories.
И мы с вами имеем право доступа к этой памяти.
And we, you and us, we have rights of access to these memories.
А третья сторона, и особенно это касается тех людей, которые моложе нас, у которых, может быть, нет такого опыта еще, надо их научить думать, надо дать им инструмент. В этом смысле мы считаем, что мы, мемориал, мы такой некоторый инструмент, который мы даем вам, миру, а ваша задача учить учеников думать самим.
And the third element of this, when it comes to people who are younger than us, maybe don't share our experiences, you have to teach them to think. You have to provide them with tools. And we, in Memorial, we are such a tool which we provide to you, to the world, and then it's your task to teach your pupils to think independently.
Замечательно, если эти люди будут уметь спорить, не соглашаться. Это и вообще прекрасно.
And it would be fantastic, it would be perfect if people learn how to argue, how to disagree.
По крайней мере, мы готовы спорить, и если с нами не соглашаются.
At least we're prepared to take up an argument if people don't agree with us.
Yes. I'm thinking of, just going back to the stories, I'm sure many of you have read Svetlana Alexievich, who received the Nobel Prize in Literature some years ago. And she collects stories, she interviewed people in the former Soviet Union. And these voices became like thematical choirs over humanity.
but she also, the people that she meets that talks about trauma and griefs and pain, many of them tells her that it's the first time they talk about it. Have Memorial met a reluctance among people to talk about their history, their experiences?
Несомненно. Да, каждый из нас есть что-то, о чем он не готов говорить. И вы, и я.
Well,
И каждый в этом зале.
Without a doubt, and you and me, we have things we're not prepared to talk about. Everyone in this room have things which they don't want to talk about.
И особенно не готовы говорить люди, с которыми не разговаривают.
Especially people who are not talked to, they're not prepared to talk.
И это трудно. И я очень уважаю и люблю Светлану именно за это, что она умеет говорить с людьми, с которыми никто не разговаривал.
And this is a very difficult task, and this is why I respect and I love Svetlana, because she has an ability to speak to people who've never been spoken to before.
Вот я так получилось. Вообще-то я живу с ней на соседней улице. И разговаривала с ней несколько дней назад.
Well, it just happened so that me and Svetlana live in neighboring streets. I just spoke to her a couple of days ago.
И как раз она рассказывала, что у нее этот интерес с детства, с 11 лет, к вот этим пожилым женщинам, которые пережили войну и остались без мужей. Как они справлялись с жизнью? Она говорила мне, что это ей интереснее, чем то, что было написано в книгах.
And she told me that she's been interested in this since she was a child. She was 11. The old women around her who survived the war, who lost their husbands, how did they manage? How did they survive this? And she said that this was more interesting to her than things she could read in books.
И я думаю, вот в этом и есть ответ. Ответ в интересе к людям. Если человек интересен, то тогда, я думаю, есть шанс с ним говорить.
And I think this is the answer. The answer is to have interest in people, and if the person is interested, then there is a chance to have a discussion with him or her.
Definitely, yeah. You said that people are welcome to argue with Memorial, and for sure, Memorial may be a Nobel Prize laureate, but not popular among everyone. At the Nobel Prize Teacher Summit last year, as many of you experienced, we had Dmitry Muratov as a guest, chief editor at the Russian paper Novaya Gazeta. Muratov, he has been accused of being a foreign agent, and so has Memorial. This according to the Russian foreign agent law. So you live in exile today. What is this law? What kind of consequences have it had for Memorial as an organization?
Это как раз несогласие с тем, что мы считаем, что правда о прошлом должна быть открыта.
This is a demonstration of disagreement with our position that the truth about the past should be open.
И это попытка лишить людей, организаций независимого голоса.
And this is an attempt to get rid of an independent voice, so that people and other organizations don't have access to that anymore.
В принципе, вообще-то любое государство хочет порядка.
So in principle, you could say that any state wants to create order.
И это нормально, мы сами поручаем государству организовать порядок нашей жизни.
Which is normal, we ourselves would delegate to the state to create order in our life.
Но если у государства нет никакого противовеса, если нет никакого голоса независимого, то постепенно государство хочет порядка все больше и больше, а независимый голос мешает ему все тоже больше и больше.
But if there are no balances, if there are no checks and balances, if there are no independent voices, then the state wants to get more and more and more order, and the independent voices become more and more in the way.
И вот тогда и возникает, кого-то хочется назвать иностранным агентом. Он ведь говорит не так, как ты считаешь, ты, государство, считаешь правильно.
And then you get an urge to declare that someone else is a foreign agent because they say the things which are different from what you believe is correct as a state.
И поверить, что человек или организация может сам занимать независимую позицию, ну, как бы трудно. Наверное, это кто-то ему из-за границы подсказал или велел. А вообще, скорее всего, даже деньги заплатил, чтобы он так говорил. Это такая простая логика.
And there is a simple logic that it's difficult to believe that someone independently would say things which oppose what the state says. So probably someone who lives abroad has told them to do that. And probably they've paid money to them as well.
И да, то происходят вот такие все больше и больше лишения людей независимости и свободы.
And then gradually people lose more and more of their freedom and their independence.
Это часто происходит, знаете, очень постепенно. Вы как бы не замечаете. Каждый день ничего особенного, просто маленький шаг.
So, and this happens slowly and gradually, and this is something you don't notice. Something happens every day. There's a small step day after day, a step day after day after day.
И вдруг оказывается, что ты не можешь, тебе угрожает уголовное преследование, ты должен, по сути, бежать из своей страны.
And then suddenly you find out that you can't be in this situation anymore. You are threatened with criminal charges, and you have more or less flee from your own country.
На суде, когда ликвидировали, вот я говорила, ликвидировали мемориал по абсолютно абсурдной абсолютно причине, как бы, ну, повод, да, нет, это было совершенно юридически абсурдно.
And during the trial, when the memorial was liquidated, due to an absolutely legally absurd reason,
нас ликвидировали за то, что мы не заплатили штрафы, которые на самом деле мы заплатили. У нас даже были подтверждающие документы.
We were liquidated because we allegedly didn't pay the fines, which we actually paid. We even had the receipts.
Но прокурор как бы не удержался и сказал на самом деле, почему он ликвидирует мемориал, почему надо ликвидировать мемориал.
But the prosecutor, he couldn't sort of control himself, and he said why they really wanted to liquidate.
Он сказал: вы, мемориал, заставляете нас стыдиться нашего прошлого, а мы хотим гордиться нашим прошлым.
He said, you, memorial, you force us to be ashamed of our future, but we want to be proud of our future. Of our past, sorry.
И когда я его спросила, а как же быть с тем, что в прошлом были преступления? Ну, они же были.
And I asked him, so, but how should you deal with the issue that there were crimes in the past? The crimes actually did take place.
Он просто оставил это без ответа.
But he didn't respond.
Лучше забыть.
So it's better to forget.
Yeah. I mean, if you're a teacher, if you're a teacher in history, you probably had a student that doesn't really get the point with history. I mean, it's like over and done with, move on. Memorial has persistently emphasized on the link between the atrocities in Soviet Union and the violations of human rights in Russia today. Can you explain that link?
Я думаю, что связь, к сожалению, она сейчас очень наглядно видна всему миру.
I think, unfortunately, the link is quite apparent to the entire world.
Потому что все спрашивают, а что случилось с Россией? Почему она ведет войну?
Because everyone is asking me, so what has happened to Russia? Why is Russia waging war?
Как это может быть с такой прекрасной литературой? Пушкин, Достоевский, такая чудесная музыка и вообще такая прекрасная русская душа. Что случилось?
So how could this be with this great Russian literature, with Pushkin and Dostoevsky and great music and the fantastic Russian soul? What has happened?
Я хочу, и мы хотим всех вернуть к вопросу о том, а какое наследство осталось от советского времени, кстати, не только в России, но в том числе в России. Какое наследство осталось? Кроме Пушкина и так далее.
But the question I want to ask is, what is the Soviet heritage in Russia, not only Russia, but in Russia from the Soviet days, apart from Pushkin and everything else?
А это наследство, во-первых, память об уничтожении и убийстве людей. Раз.
This heritage is the memories of destruction and murder of people. That's number one.
Это страх.
It's fear.
И этот страх возвращается очень быстро. Не надо уже убивать сотни тысяч. Достаточно убить одного. И этот страх возвращается.
And this fear, it comes back really quickly. You no longer have to murder hundreds and thousands of people. You can murder one, and this fear comes back.
И это наследство, это люди не верят в право, в то, что можно себя защитить в суде. Люди не верят в демократию, потому что это что-то слишком абстрактное. Это не наследство.
So due to this heritage, people don't trust the rule of law. They don't believe they can protect themselves in court. People don't trust in democracy because it becomes something abstract. So this is not the heritage which was received.
И поэтому мы поэтому видим то, что происходит. Эта связь очень прямая, и мы, как мемориал, это очень горько выступать в роли Кассандры и говорить, вот мы говорили, что будет плохо, а теперь плохо. Это ужасно неприятно.
And this is the direct link. And it's for us as Memorial, we've been talking about this, and it feels very bitter to be in a position of Cassandra saying, we were saying that things will become horrible, now they're horrible, but this is a very bitter experience.
Но ведь мы действительно много лет говорили, то, что в России грубо и массово внутри России нарушаются права человека, это опасно.
But we have been saying for many, many years that the fact that the human rights are violated inside of Russia very seriously, in a very large scope, this is something which is quite dangerous.
Государство, которое нарушает права собственных граждан, раньше или позже станет опасным для соседей. И так и получилось.
A state which violates the rights of its own citizens will sooner or later become a danger to its neighbors, and this is exactly what happens.
И это прямая связь прошлого и настоящего. Повторяю, я не хочу, чтобы вы из этого разговора и вообще из разговора о мемориале выносили вот это жуткое чувство. Нет.
And this is the direct link between the past and the present. And I don't want you to carry with you this horrible feeling from this discussion or the conversation about memorial, not so.
Наше прошлое — это тяжелый урок, но он дает нам надежду, что если мы это понимаем, то мы это сможем не повторить.
Our past is a difficult lesson, but it gives us hope that if we understand that past, then there is hope that we'll never repeat it again.
Yeah, William Faulkner said that the past is never dead, it's not even past, which is a good thought. At the Nobel Prize Museum, you can find a drawing donated by Memorial. It is depicting a prison camp in Siberia, drawn by a 19-year-old prisoner who was sentenced to 8 years of work camp for anti-Soviet propaganda. One individual, one life, and a witness to the worst that humanity is capable of. In the same time, you have pointed out, Elena, Zhemkova, that we in this drawing also can see the very best in humanity, dreams and our hope. So thank you for that, and a warm hand to Elena Zhemkova.
И большое спасибо человеку, который помог.
And I understood that. Yeah. So thank you, Vadim, as well. There you go. So we are soon reaching the end of this summit, and we're so grateful to you and to our guests here on stage that have enlightened this amazing organ of ours, our brain. If I was a teacher, then I couldn't say this because then I would be bragging. But I'm not a teacher, so I can speak freely. There are many similarities between you teachers and Nobel Prize laureates. You both advocate knowledge, exploration, reflection, and truth, and you are persistent in this. And that would perhaps be very easy in a simple world, but the world is not simple, as we know. So it is courageous to teach, to persist on us having the capacity to become creative, constructive, and dignified. To teach that it is possible for our brains to balance between questioning information and to trust in facts, a necessity in a democracy. And speaking of democracy, that will actually be the theme of our next Nobel Prize Teacher Summit on March 28th. And the registration is already open, so we hope to see you all there. Thank you so much.
On behalf of all of us at the Nobel Prize Museum, thank you very much. Please join us outside for some bubbles and jazz.